Very good. Well, welcome to this week's topic for the beginning ham radio series. It's battery backup. This actually can be a multi-day topic. We're going to try to just touch on like the high level stuff. And if you have any questions on your particular situation, or you want to find out more about how to get involved with having or creating a battery backup, feel free to ask any of the questions in the last half of this meeting. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, AA7PB. He's going to lead our battery backup topic.
Very good. It looks like, nope. Gotta get Max to turn on screen share.
Cool. I think you can start.
Yeah, it's on now. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I got to remember which window I put all this stuff in. I think it's this window. And I need to scroll up. All right, I'm going to try to make this kind of show and tell. And between Max and I, will get you one or more web links afterwards to so that you can use this as reference material, especially since it's got some web links in it that I don't expect you to copy off the screen. So I recommend you kind of focus on trying to follow the discussion, ask questions, and don't take too many notes, except for things that are not on the slides, which feel free to take those notes, but don't copy the material because you'll have that later. So the primary way to keep your radio charged is to plug it in. But we're going to be talking tonight about, well, what if the power's out? Or what if you're at a field day? Or what if you're doing a summit on the air on a mountain, or there's a major disaster? The battery that's in your radio is not going to last too long, depending on how much you transmit. The first thing you need to do for the handheld is shop for a spare battery and keep that spare battery charged. If you're already have or are planning on getting a mobile radio, they are, of course, designed to go in vehicles, and therefore they're conceptually easy to charge on a 12-volt or to run on a 12-volt battery because that's their native power, 12 volts DC. It's a little tricky to cable them into a vehicle, but you can get people to help you on that if you haven't been down that road. But if you have one of those and you're at a field day at a picnic bench and you have a 12-volt battery, you basically just need a way to clip onto that 12-volt battery, and you're good for as long as that particular battery is good. And so I'm going to start talking about those kind of batteries. You can also run them directly off of a vehicle by opening the hood and clipping them on there, although that may not be too convenient. I'm sure people do it. There are some differences between the batteries we'll be talking about a little bit, just until it gets too confusing. And then later I'll talk about how these same 12-volt batteries can be used to recharge a handheld that may or may not be running off 12 volts. So we'll talk about how to adapt the 12 volts to whatever voltage your handheld is using. So think about these batteries from both two different ways. Supplying 12-volt power to a mobile radio. I've got a radio sitting here behind my computer here that's probably too big to put in most vehicles, more of a desktop. But the tradition of ham radio these days is they don't come with cords to plug into the wall. You buy a separate power supply to use them as a base station, and then you can move them to your vehicle later, or you can carry them to a picnic bench, like I said, and hook them up to a battery there. So the most common battery until very recently to be used with these is an Agm battery. Augmented glass mat is what that stands for. It's a type of sealed battery that doesn't involve adding water to every so often. And is almost all of them are designed for what's called deep cycle. The battery in your car is optimized for providing a lot of amps to start the engine, even on a cold day, but it pretty much assumes, its design assumes that as soon as that happens, it's immediately recharged by the alternator. If you're operating on a picnic bench or in a vehicle where the engine's not on, you don't want a battery that loses its life because you're not top charging it continuously. And an AGM battery is designed for that case. Because it's a lead acid battery, it's heavy and its weight is very proportional to the number of amp hours, and amp hours are equivalent to watt hours. If you ever need to convert amp hours of one of these kind of batteries to watt hours, multiply by 12. If somebody tells you you need a certain number of watt hours and you're planning on getting that from one of these batteries, divide by 12. You can go back and forth pretty easy by multiplying, dividing by 12. I did a little research, and depending on the source you check, these batteries are designed so you could take them down to 50% charge between 200 and 600 times, and they will still provide about 80% of the charge after that. Eventually they'll die, as in they'll get a short and they'll no longer provide 12 or 13 volts. But the problem that you'll have first is they won't hold quite the rated charge. So if you bought a battery with 26 amp hours fully charged, it's going to have 26 amp hours. After a whole bunch of duty cycles or several years, it's not going to hold 26 amp hours. It's going to hold 22 amp hours, but it will probably still start at about 13 volts when you start using it. And as you discharge these kind of batteries, when they get to about 50% of charge, you want to hesitate on using them for two reasons. One is if you go much below 50%, you're shortening their life. And the other is if you go below 50%, they're probably going to be providing about 11 volts, 11.2 volts. And the radio you've got them hooked to will say, no, I'm not going to continue. That's not enough for me. And you'll either they'll cut out every time you transmit, or they'll just shut themselves down to protect themselves from low voltage. So to get a little techie here, another way of thinking about this, if you buy 26 amp hours in this technology, you're typically going to get about 13 amp hours out of it before it's time to recharge it. You could use it to charge 5-volt batteries after that, but you're not going to be using it to transmit with a ham radio when it's below 50% charge. Now, examples that make this perhaps more interesting than me talking is, here's one for $55 called Mighty Max. It's one of many that are about this size and this capacity. This is 26 amp hours that are clones of a name brand called, that's on the next page, Werker, or Worker is how we would pronounce it in the US, but I think it's probably originally a German brand, probably pronounced Werker. And this is a name brand. They're hard to track down these days because their market has kind of been stolen from them by all the clones. But if you want a top quality AGM battery, consider buying one of these. Inevitably, because they're top quality name brand, they're more dollars per amp hour. This is not quite apples to apples. This one on the screen is 33 amp hours at $105, while the off-brand one is 26 amp hours for $55. So you can see a difference even if you don't have your calculator there. And I provide almost all the web links I'll give you are Amazon, just because I'm lazy and I go there first, but couldn't find this battery on Amazon, so I found it on Batteries Plus. And I think something popped up when I was on Batteries Plus that said if I order this battery online and pick it up locally, they'll give me a 10% discount. So that would bring it below $100. Now, if you talk to about 60% or more hams these days, they'll say, don't waste your money on AGM batteries. Get lithium iron phosphate. That AGM stuff is last year's story. Lithium iron phosphate has been around for several years now and is starting to become a bit more affordable. Definitely designed for deep cycle in terms of running it without immediately recharging it. It's sealed like the AGM batteries, but it's a lot less heavy. I forgot to look that up, but roughly speaking, for the same amp hours, it's going to weigh about a third or a quarter of a lead acid battery. So if you're thinking about putting one of these in a backpack, you're not going to want to carry a lead acid battery around. You're going to want a lithium iron phosphate. And if you're going to put one in a plastic carry case, depending on whether you're just carrying it out to your car, then maybe a lead acid is okay. But if you're going to carry it from a parking lot down a hill and up somewhere to a picnic bench, you're probably going to wish you spent money on lithium iron oxide, lithium iron phosphate. I'm not talking tonight about regular lithium batteries. They're not common for ham radio use, although they're technically feasible. They are a little bit lighter for the same amp hours, but they're more complicated to keep charged without getting what's called thermal runaway, as in they catch on fire. With the right technology, lithium batteries are safe. They're in your cell phone, but they're harder to keep safe. So ham radio has gravitated, it's kind of jumped a generation to lithium iron phosphate, even though they're not quite as dense. They're a pretty good solution. Here's an off-brand called Talent Cell. It happens to be the one I bought because I'm cheap, $164 for 24 amp hours. You can see in the bullets, another big advantage is the number of duty cycles, as in discharge and then recharge them later, is going to be 2 to 4 times as many as AGM batteries, depending on how well you take care of them. And so that they could be worth your money, even though, look at the price. The off-brand is $164. And if you go for a name brand, the one that a lot of people recommend you stick with because it's got a great reputation as working and having a long life, $360 for 40 amp hours. Again, these are not quite apples to apples, but if you've got $360 to spend on a battery, this is a good one to get. And because BioNOE is a name brand, their website has some really nice resources, including some pages specific to amateur radio. So I provide those links. I won't dwell on what this covers, but you can see it if you want to drill down. There's some good stuff on that website. And if you get these batteries, you're not going to probably charge them with the trickle charger you got for your auto battery 30 years ago. You're going to need to invest in a more specific charger. Here's a charger that's AGM specific. It's only 1.5 amps, so it'll take a long time to charge a big battery, but it's quite affordable. And then you can go up in amperage to 4 amps. This one's specific to lithium iron phosphate and does not do AGM. And there's another one in that line. And then here's one that I have that is good for both lithium iron phosphate and AGM. Since I own one of each, this was a good value for me to get a charger that could handle either one of those. Eventually, if you buy an AGM battery, you're going to start thinking about reconditioning it so that it lasts longer than it might otherwise. So you may want at some point to invest in a fancier charger that's also a reconditioner. NoCo Genius is a brand. This is the 2 amp version for $50. If you want 5 amps, you pay about $70. And you can just keep going up from there in terms of how fast they charge. You don't want to overspend on amps because the rule of thumb, Max may remember, I think the rule of thumb is you want to charge at about 10%, I think, of the amp hours. So if you have a 25 amp hour battery, you typically would be charging it at 2 to 3 amps, and buying one that could charge it at 15 amps is, depending on the one you get, either overkill or a bad idea, in that it might charge it too fast. A lot of these are smart chargers, and they won't charge a battery faster than it's capable of taking the charge. And my impression, for instance, if you bought this one's big brother because you had a giant battery and then used it on a smaller battery, it would adapt. But read the fine print to make sure that you don't charge one of your batteries too fast. The technology we're talking about, they're unlikely to catch on fire, but they will heat up if you charge them too fast, and that will shorten their life. Let's see, I think that's the end. I've got 2 other show and tells, time permitting. Why don't I take questions before I launch into more material? Max, I haven't been following chat. Are there questions in chat?
Not yet. Somebody agreed that they like the LifePo batteries.
Okay.
I actually do also. I know they're expensive. I think I've just drained too many lead acid batteries and kind of turned them into bricks. So one of the biggest issues that I had with lead acid batteries is managing the shutoff when they were drained. When they reached their 50% level. I know there's devices out there that can turn off the load when it reaches a certain percentage, but even those devices use energy from the battery, and if you were to leave that on for a few months, then you will end up killing your battery anyway.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. If you check with me in a couple of years, I might have a more informed opinion because I have one of each. Historically, I've had good luck with AGM batteries because I have a sailboat that has AGM batteries. And when those AGM batteries die on that sailboat, I'm going to be tempted to buy lithium iron phosphate, but the sticker shop will probably kill me because of the number of amp hours I would need. So there is a trade-off. Besides this cost trade-off and this weight trade-off, I have a theory that we could probably debate if we had time, because I'm not sure it's right, that if you have a battery that you're keeping for emergency deployment, and you've got one of these nice little chargers, and you either keep it on the charger or you put it on the charger for a few hours every few weeks, I think an AGM battery is going to last a long time because you're not taking it through a lot of cycles, except when you're deployed. It might last 6, 7, 8 years and still be going fine because it's for emergency communications, and we hope not to have too many emergencies. On the other hand, if you're really active at summits on the air, and you're driving up to a summit that has a parking lot, you might be able to take a lead acid battery because you're not going up on foot or on a bicycle. But if you do that every weekend over 5 years, that's a lot of duty cycles, and you're probably going to wear out your AGM battery. And lithium iron phosphate is going to now be your triple friend because it'll take more cycles, way less, and keep its voltage up longer than an AGM battery would.
Bruce, I was just going to chime in here. One of the things for a lot of the folks out here to keep in mind is you may not need the 40 amp hour or larger type of options of the lithium iron phosphates, especially, let's say, if you're a net person and you're going to be out on foot and doing things. Oftentimes, you might consider something that, like, this is a BioNO, hopefully people can see it. This one is, let's see, this is a 6 amp hour, so it's not still cheap, but much less expensive, quite lightweight given everything. And even during the recent power outages, I could power laptops, cell phones, and 2-meter radios off of it just fine. I don't think it would last 2 weeks without a recharge. But you may not be in a position to need some of the larger ones unless you're setting up a home emergency situation where you want everything to be at home with higher power. But if you're going to be more mobile or not needing a great deal, then you don't really need to think about some of the larger, more expensive batteries. Many of us could get by with the smaller lithium iron phosphate. Just one last plug for the BioNO. One of the nice things is that they come also equipped with power poles. And if you're not familiar with power poles, let's just say the amateur radio slogan is "Power Pole the World." It's become the universal connective device. And if you notice on this, it has 2 connections. It has the typical barrel connection, which is useful for a lot of radios. And you can either input or output on that, and the same with the power poles, input and output. And I just like the fact that it was all done and put together. You can certainly pick up the less expensive ones and add your own power poles as well. There's just some extra thoughts on that.
Max, if your master schedule doesn't already have power poles on it, you might want to add that. And I could either help with the presentation or share some material I presented for one. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the power pole world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me shift gears a little bit to try to tie things together with the reality of connecting to your radio. You may want one of these until you have the power pole capability, because you can clip this on to pretty much any of these batteries, and then you get what we used to call a cigarette lighter, now oftentimes called 12 volt DC receptacle. And then what do you do with that? You can hook up an inverter, and then whatever charger you're already using to charge your handheld radio, you can plug into this inverter, depending on which one you buy in terms of how many watts it supplies. But the little ones are not expensive. And if you squint or read the title of this, it not only has 2 receptacles for plugging in regular household appliances, so to speak, it has 2 USB connectors for charging your cell phones. So that would be a way of using these batteries by one of the cigarette lighter things above and one of these. But if you're just charging DC things, the battery operated things like handhelds, there's a certain amount of inefficiency because this converts the DC to AC, and then your charger is going to convert it back to DC, and both of those are going to consume energy and heat. And if you're trying to live off of a 10 amp hour or 26 amp hour battery, you don't want to be generating a lot of heat. So you want to consider what kind of thing you could use that will go DC to DC, which is much more efficient. And let's see if I need to.
Bruce, this is Sam. I had a quick question on the chargers.
Yeah.
Are those like battery tenders, or that can stay connected all the time, or are they meant for charge and remove?
I think all the ones that I showed are the modern ones that when they get to full charge, they will either turn themselves into standby, or they will go to a very low amperage trickle to keep the battery charged.
Okay.
So you want to do a little bit of research to make sure you understand what they do. I don't worry about disconnecting as soon as they charge, except that I usually have another battery that needs attention, so I switch them to that when that happens.
Got it.
Um,
I've used a battery tender on a motorcycle. That
Yeah, the
sounded
battery
very
tenders,
similar.
some of the battery tenders also have the reconditioning feature built into them. Some of them do it fairly automatically, and some have a special mode you put them in for reconditioning a battery. And that's particularly useful for AGM batteries to extend their life. Here's another set of things that kind of connect things. If you want to go DC to DC and you've got a Baofeng radio, you can, for only $10, you can get a new cradle that, instead of hooking to a so-called wall wart to plug into your wall, it plugs into either your car receptacle, which could be handy if you're on the road, or into that adapter that I showed you on the previous page. Then if you've got a bit more expensive radio like a Yaesu, you may be able to track down the equivalent, or you might be able to get just an adapter. This is made by a third party called Circuit, spelled with a K. And for a bunch of the Yaesu AC chargers, you don't really plug them directly into the wall. You plug them into a wall wart that produces the DC at 12 volts. So this gizmo provides that connection for you, and you can use the existing cradle. So these are just examples of how you can piece together solutions for handhelds. And this type of solution will tend to be quite a bit more efficient, produce less heat and more charge to keep your handhelds charged when their main battery is gone out. To complete that idea is, unless it's a really short deployment, the battery in your radio plus the backup battery is not sufficient. When you swap the backup battery into your radio, you want a way of charging the battery that you started out with, and technology like this connected to a bigger battery, whether it's a small one like Dan showed, or one of the bigger ones that I was showing, could extend your ability for deployment or field day or a backpacking trip or whatever. Questions about those?
I would just comment that if you wanted to, for example, run your laptop or any other appliance or anything that you have, I would say the same thing that Bruce said. Like, if you can find an adapter that will use DC rather than AC, that way you won't go through the DC to AC to DC conversion, because you do lose a lot that way. So for my laptop, for example, I just ordered a cigarette lighter adapter charge cable off of eBay, and I can use that then without using an inverter.
So Max and Bruce, I have a question. So if I have a biannual small battery with the power poles, what kind of arrangements do I need to, let's say, power up my HT? I understand that I might have to do a different connector adjustment there, but in terms of voltages,
I did a little sampling of that, and there's so many HTs, I clearly wasn't comprehensive. But the cradles that you get for your HTs tend to be in the range 5 to 12 volts. So if it's 12 volts, you potentially just make up any type of cable that will fit if you're handy with a soldering iron, and you should be okay. If it's 5 volts, you might be able to get an adapter that goes off a USB charger, and there's obviously ways of charging your cell phone from your car, and so that might be the way. But if you find out that your radio is cradle is assuming 7.5 volts, then you're going to have to do a little bit more research, and the first thing I would look for is somebody to sell an adapter cable that fits into a so-called cigarette lighter receptacle, because you can either literally do that in your vehicle, or you can buy one of those jumper cables that I showed you and recharge whatever is the right voltage. So,
So Bruce,
yeah.
Dan in the past mentioned to me something called a buck converter. What is a buck converter?
A buck converter is a electronic circuit that basically takes the DC that it's given and has a feedback circuit that starts going, allowing the voltage to drop. And when it gets to the target voltage, it feeds back and brings it back. And so it's got a slight ripple in it, but a really good one. It was got a tiny ripple. So imagine that the input was 12 and you wanted 7. The buck converter would bring the voltage down to 7 and then up to 7.1 and then down to 7. And so the output would be equivalent to 7 volts DC. And so if you bought one of these off of Amazon, let's say, you could get a tiny screwdriver and make a couple of adjustments, and you could take 13.8 in one side and get 4 out the other side, or you could readjust it to take 16 volts in and put out 11.
I see. Okay, thank
So
you.
it's a DC to DC circuit. Dan, did you want to explain it better?
Yeah, no. That's a good explanation, but I just wanted to give a simpler solution. And again, instead of trying to throw this all together yourself, which if you're handy is great, but if you just want to be able to pick up something to use, PowerWorks makes a very nice, simple cable that will accept up to 30 volts, from 10 to 30 volts input, and convert it to 5 or 5.1 output to USB. And so that it's all in one simple cable, one simple package. And of course, that's just assuming you wish a USB output, but it's a very practical and simple way to deal with that issue. If you're trying to go from the bio battery to your cell phone or to your laptop, assuming that, USB input for power or any device. So that's a very simple solution that you might look into. The company is called PowerWorks, WERX.
Right. Yeah, they have a lot of neat products. They're fun. Their website's quite the toy store of neat products.
Yeah.
And to tie the concept together, some of the stuff I've shown on the screen that produces the desired voltage, inside it's got a buck converter. It's a common circuit that costs somewhere between, depending on how much wattage it takes, between 50 cents and $20 to manufacture. And you can go crazy with buck converters. I haven't done this yet, but a friend of mine bought 5 for $12, and he's going to build various things out of these. But you can buy them prepackaged, and I'm sure inside the one that Dan was talking about was a prepackaged buck converter that doesn't require soldering, et cetera. One other dimension to all of this is buying commercial battery packs. Here's a Bioenno one for $500. Inside, there's one of their high-tech batteries, but it's got all the different connectors you could imagine needing if you're on the road, so to speak. And then, of course, they have competition from third parties coming in various sizes and shapes and prices to give you a lot of flexibility. And most of them inside have lithium iron phosphate, but of different manufacturers, so they may not all be as high quality as Bioenno. So we must have exceeded half an hour by now. How are we doing, Max?
Yeah, I think so. We have about half an hour left, and so we can just take general questions if you have any. I guess that my parting point battery backup is that if you have an HT, a handheld, or a mobile radio at home, you may want to think about some type of battery backup that may last you anywhere from half a day to a few days. So it depends on how big your wallet is. And there's nothing wrong with the lead acid batteries, especially in a situation like that where you kind of always have a trickle charger attached to it. And it's really nice because when the power goes out, one of the first things that I do here is turn on my radio just to find out what's happening, not only in my neighborhood, but beyond my neighborhood, in my city and my county. And so you can't do that unless you have some type of battery backup. And usually for handhelds, especially, the batteries that come with the handhelds are kind of the Achilles heel of the handhelds. Oftentimes, if you leave them for a month or 2 or 3 months, there's not a lot of battery left in them. So I think that's my main point. Any questions from anybody for Bruce? I know. Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me? This is
Hi,
Sandy.
Sandy.
KJ7QQB. I have a question about gel cell batteries. I have an associate who said he has a gel cell battery that has 20 amp hours of life left. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Are gel cell batteries something that we could use? And if so, I know that I would have to recharge this battery periodically. Is one of the chargers that you were demonstrating like a 2 amp or a 5 amp charger? Would that be good for a gel cell, or is a gel cell not good at all?
Gel cell, I would say is an excellent option. It's less common these days. One of the chargers I have, whenever I tell it to go to AGM, I go through pushing the button, and there's 1 tap gives me gel cell, 2 taps gives me AGM. So there are a lot of chargers out there that will produce the right voltage and current to recharge a gel cell. I read something just today on the internet that implied that a gel cell might, in some sense, a little better than an AGM battery, but a bit more expensive. But if you got a good source of one, unless somebody knows different, I would expect it would be a good solution.
Would that 20 amp hour life battery last me a while if I kept it recharged?
Well, normally you think about 20 amp hours as a measure of watt hours. And if you were running you were on your radio, and let's say your radio drew 1/10 of an amp when you were listening and 1 amp when you were transmitting, then 20 amp hours in theory would last 20 hours. And if you did a lot more listening than transmitting, it might last for 40 hours. So there's a fair amount of math to try to guess. But that generally, this battery I've got on the screen, I think it's still on screen share. 20 amp hour AGM battery would be just a little bit smaller than this one. And a 40 amp hour AGM battery would be proportionally larger than this one. But the other thing that the person may have been telling you is that on that battery, it was originally, when purchased, it was 26 amp hours. And because it's gone through a lot of duty cycles, its capacity is now 20, which means that today, tomorrow, and the next day, it's still got 20. But if it's on its last year of life, it might be down to 5 amp hours a year from now. And so you're not going to want to spend too much on a battery that's on its last year.
If I could further ask another question, I was one of the people who put into the chat, how do you connect a battery to your radio? I have a mobile radio. It's a Yaesu, and I know that you were talking about power poles, and that you were thinking about talking about that in the future. Is this one way to connect a battery that I would have to my radio?
Let me see if power poles are definitely a technology that you're going to want to come up to speed on, but you don't have to do that in over the next month.
Okay.
Unless you're just curious and want to get a little bit ahead of the game. The gizmo that I have on the screen now, you could clip on almost any of these batteries and you would have the equivalent of the receptacle in your car. So what would that be good for? If you have a Baofeng radio, let me switch to that page. Sorry, I got too many pages here and stand by. If you got a Baofeng radio, you would then buy one of these, plug it into that other thing and drop your radio into this cradle and you're done. If you've got a Yaesu radio and it happens to be one of the ones listed here, the X6R, the 5R, 471, or the very popular 60R, you would buy this adapter cable for the cradle you already own, plug this into that other adapter I showed you, and plug the end that's not quite on the screen here into your cradle, and you could charge your AT off of any of the batteries we're talking about.
One quick point on that, some of those, and I'm not familiar with all the radios, you may not be able to operate the radio while charging. So a better solution might be to see if you can get somebody like a simple cord like this with the power connector to your radio on this end and the power poles on the other end will allow you to immediately connect the battery, the BioNO, this way directly to your radio. And
so it would connect directly to my mobile radio.
Oh, well, now it depends on which type of radio you have.
I have a Yaesu FTM 300D.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a vehicular radio, and you know you're probably going to want to. That's going to have more power draw. I'm not particularly familiar with that model, but I think some of the things that Bruce was talking about may be more applicable.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking you might have had a handheld.
Yeah.
I have a handheld FT60 as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so the
I comment on that one?
Yeah.
If you don't want to go to the power pole solution right away, the FT60 could be handled by the one on the screen here.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. This gets pretty complicated. Dan's right. A pretty good percentage of the nice handhelds will take an external battery directly, but some of them don't have that connector, or when you plug into that connector, they turn themselves off because they think you're trying to charge them.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Good point. Good point.
Yeah, and Sandy, you definitely want to learn a little bit about power poles, and I added that to the list of upcoming topics that we have. But in the meantime, because you have a mobile radio, you can just simply attach your mobile radio. It'll come with bare wires at the end. You can attach those directly to the battery. There will be at least one or two fuses in that line if you use the one that came in the box. And so that's safe to do in that particular configuration.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then Robert, I think, had a question.
Hey, Bruce, I was just would encourage you to also include the link to your page about building the battery box. I think it's a real good solution.
Oh, okay. So Robert knows about a presentation I made a few months ago. Okay, so that's 4 links that I owe Max that I'm happy to provide them.
Yeah, absolutely. ATN had a question about a vehicle jump charging batteries for use, I think, in portable situations, because they're pretty lightweight. He made reference to one on Amazon, and it's an 1800 hour tech life battery. Before Bruce, you can comment on it, but would like to point out that it does say it's 1800 milliamp hour, which is 18 amp hour if you do the conversion. However, I'm pretty sure that that 1800 milliamp hour is at 3.6 volts. So they kind of do a little trickery where they're not doing it at 12 volts, which yes, it does have 12 volt output, but they're only doing it at 3.6. So it sounds like a much bigger battery than it is. And for $70, I would actually go with the 6 amp hour Bioenno or similar battery. But that's just my thought.
Yeah, that's a subtle one. I was giving a presentation on subject kind of halfway between the various subjects, and somebody suggested that solution. And after the presentation, I fell in love with it, and I got one for each of our cars. And before I put it in the glove compartment, I showed my wife how she can run her cell phone off of it for a very long time. The original purpose, if I'm thinking of the one that you're talking about, is using lithium technology to start your car if your main battery dies when you really need it. And it's amazing that a relatively small lithium battery will start not probably a big diesel truck, but a typical sedan. It may be able to start once out of this lithium battery, but then many of the manufacturers said, well, people need another excuse for buying this. So we'll put a buck converter inside it and supply you 5 volts via USB connectors, and you can run your cell phones off of them. Is that Matt's what we're talking about here?
Yep, exactly. And
Okay.
I find them very useful, especially for jump starting cars. It's amazing how in the last, I have 3 of them. They're the NOCO brand. And it's amazing how many times I've used it actually to help other people jumpstart their cars when they need it. Unfortunately, I think one of the 3 that I have did swell up, and I was surprised to see the case is actually designed for when the battery swells up, it doesn't completely split the case open, rather that it just kind of expands it. So, but because they're LiPo, L-I-P-O, not LiFePO, they have a little bit more tendency to swell up, and they don't necessarily have the best battery management system in them. I still like them though.
Hey, Max.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've noticed on the those power pack ones, the ones that have, you know, gazillions of amp hours, except that they're like, as you said, 3.2 volts or something, is that they don't really, some of their jacks have like 16 volts or something like that. It's not really useful for radios. It's a little bit out of the range for them. So you have to check that really carefully. So the some of the jack op ranges for it.
That's a very good point. Yeah, if you can actually buy the LiPo, L-I-P-O batteries from a hobby shop or online. They're used a lot in RC cars and drones. I did buy a few of them, but kind of figured out very quickly they weren't going to be the best fit for ham radio. You're very right. When they are full, they're just over 16 volts, which is not good for most ham radios. Most ham radios, they operate at 13.8 volts plus or minus 10%. And unfortunately, that is not quite 16 volts. So you don't want to plug in like a drone LiPo battery into your expensive radio that can't handle over 16 volts. Any other questions for Bruce?
Hi, this is Sam. I
Hey,
had
Sam.
one more. MFJ makes a power supply strip that I have seen where it can take power from a battery or solar or other sources and then go to a Anderson connection or other output. Does anyone have experience with those?
You're probably talking about their newer Epic series of Basically, it can take solar, but it also kind of does some protection and charging for the different types of batteries. Are you familiar with that, Bruce?
No, not at all.
Okay, I mean, I really like them. They are a little bit spendy. I think they run about $110 to $120. They do have some nice over voltage and under voltage protection. So if you are going to use especially a lead acid or AGM battery, it'll help protect it from being drawn down too much. Because like Bruce mentioned earlier, if you discharge a lead acid battery down to 10% or 0%, you might get away with it once if you recharge it very quickly. However, if you don't, or if you do it more than one time, you're looking at maybe a 50-pound door weight or something like that. So they're very good. I think another topic that we can have later could be on just battery management and what they call low power gates. So a power gate is a device that you can put in line with a battery and a radio that will help keep the battery charged and help it switch over from a power supply within milliseconds to a battery backup. Sometimes they're nice to have, although I find more and more in my battery designs, I'm not using them as much. There you go. Bruce has one up there. That's I think it can handle up to 16 amps, and you plug a battery, a power supply, and some type of load, radio, lights, or anything else into it. And as soon as the power supply no longer supplies power, then it will immediately switch over to the battery. I kind of think I have a few of those, but I really like kind of the other more simple option of just attaching some type of a trickle charge or a charger to a battery, and then attaching your load, which would be the radio or whatever else that you're using. In my Go box, I use a 30 amp hour battery. I have a 6 amp charger, and I used to have a power supply in it, although I took it out just because honestly, 6 amps is going to more, like if I plug that in, it's going to more than cover my battery power requirements.
I first learned about them from a friend at a field day, and he was using it differently than what the book says. He had battery connected into the battery port and another battery connected in to the wall DC, if you will. And when the battery went below a certain voltage, it switched to the other one and gave him plenty of time then to either recharge one of the batteries or go get a third battery and swap it in. So the field station stayed up while the battery swap occurred. So that was another use of the same little gizmo.
Yeah, I really like that idea, Bruce. That's excellent.
So Max, I wonder if I can usurp your meeting just for a moment.
Absolutely.
I posted into the chat that the Hoodview Amateur Radio Club will be having their meeting at 7:30 this evening. And Greg, KI7 EHA, is going to be talking about Summits on the Air. It's a way to carry your radios to the top of a mountain and play radio. So if anyone's interested, the link is in the chat and we'll be there until this meeting ends. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think somebody specifically had a question on SOTA and POTA. So that sounds like the perfect meeting to go to the coming up right after this meeting. Thanks, ATN. Any other questions? Ham radio related in general?
Oh, just a footnote. If you squinted at the thing I held up on the screen, it proved Dan's point. There were a whole bunch of power pole connectors on that little gizmo.
Yeah, as I said, the slogan is "Power Pole the World." Yeah, there you go. Yeah, yep, yeah, very good. Oh, hey, Bruce, I don't know. Did you talk about the relative voltage curve between the lead acid and the lithium, the LiFePO4. Did you talk about that?
I hinted at it without using the word curve. So let me give an explanation and then I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah.
If you are running an AGM battery, as its capacity goes along, it will gradually lose volts, and lose volts, and eventually it'll get down to zero, but by that time you quit using it. Depending on the equipment you're using, it might cut out at some point because it needs more voltage than it's getting. The lithium iron phosphate, as it's using its capacity, it stays at about 13 volts, 13 volts, 13 volts, 13 volts, and then 12.9. And then finally, when it gets to really low, it'll start dropping the voltage. So you get more usable capacity that way because it holds the voltage up during that discharge. Dan, did it get anywhere close?
Oh, no, that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, just because some of the radios are sensitive to a certain level of voltage. You know, in the old days when we were using a lot of the tube rigs and so forth, you know, you could sag that voltage down to 10 volts or whatever and everything. You know, the performance would fall off a little bit, but the radio would keep working. But with a lot of the solid states, you know, they're much more sensitive to that. So that's one advantage to the lithiums. You know, if you're in the field, particularly using it, you can get that, you know, that voltage will stay up. It will drop like a rock when it finally goes. So that's one of the things you have to be aware of, but it will maintain itself. That was all. I mean, you got it. So no need for anything else.
And Dan, I kind of want to highlight one thing that you said earlier that I think is really important to highlight again, just because it's so important. When you're comparing lead acid to lithium iron phosphate batteries, this would be the big heavy lead acid versus something like the bioenno. In general, you can get almost all of the amp hours or all of the power, the rated power out of a lithium iron phosphate, like the bioenno. You can really only get about half out of a lead acid. So if you buy lead acid that is rated at 20 amp hours, if you're getting more than 10 amp hours out of it, you're killing your battery early. Whereas a bioenno or similar lithium iron phosphate, you can get almost the full 20 amp hours out of it. So you'll want to keep that in your calculation. So if you're going with lead acid, buy a 20 amp hour. If you're going with lithium iron phosphate, go with 10 amp hour, and you'll get about the same performance or about the same energy out.
Yeah. And one other point on the lithium, the LiFePO4s, is that they will hold their charge for, you know, up to 6 to 9 months and still have 90% of the capacity. I'm not sure on the AGMs or the lead acids how much they'll hold. Some of them may. And I know a lot of folks are still using the AGMs and lead acids if they're doing like a home system, you know, maybe with solar where they're actually putting power back into the grid and so on. And cost-wise, I think it's in those situations, if you have a large bank, you know, it's still probably a lot more cost-effective to go with the lead acids. You know,
I have a question. Is it also recharge time an important factor? I mean, let's say the disaster strike and I'm basically here in my neighborhood with a tent and I'm supposed to man a position with a radio. I can assume that, you know, not nearby me, but somewhere close by, there might be somebody running a generator. And so I can send a battery to recharge. If I have an AGM, recharging the battery takes much more time than with a LiFePO4, right?
Bruce, can you comment on that? I'm not, I would think that's the case, but I don't have any hard data.
The short answer is I don't know. I did read something about relative charge rate, but it may have been arguing that the AGMs can be charged faster than flooded car batteries. So that would, I think we'll leave that as homework to the student to figure out.
I think I
So
think,
it may depend upon the capacity of your charger.
right.
That might be the factor there.
And also,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Um,
if you're using a small battery, like in this case, a 6 amp-hour bioenno, as opposed to a 10 or 20 amp lead acid, I mean, just the smaller capacity may recharge quicker on the bioenno or the LiFePO 4, but I don't know.
Yeah, Marino, I know that you are pretty up on the battery stuff. Did you have any comments on that too?
No, I'm not. I don't consider
Okay.
myself up on the battery stuff.
I have a comment on the bioenno if you will entertain one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Our net does have a 30 amp hour bioenno battery, and the instructions on it that I've been using say that it should stay on the charger for, I think it's either 4 or 5 hours to properly top it off, because it has smarts inside of it to make sure all cells are properly topped off. So I guess 4 hours, 5 hours is what would be recommended to, and I've charged it from a completely dead battery. I ran it down until it stopped powering my radio, and I tried it in 5 hours, it would fully charge the battery easily.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lee. And kind of what he's speaking about is there are a lot of cells inside of these bioenno power, or I'm sorry, I keep saying bioenno power, but the lithium iron ferrophosphate with a BMS, a battery management system. And you don't necessarily need to do it every single charge, but it's a good idea to do it every 4th or at least every 5th charge, is leave it plugged in, because what it will do is once it charges all the cells, then it'll start balancing the cells, which means it'll make sure that each individual cell is charged up all the way. That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, it has 2 colored lights on the charger, and for the initial charge where it's fast charging, it's one color, and then when it goes into this top off charge, it turns to a different color. And so that's one indicator of what it's doing. One of the reasons we thought it would be useful to have this bioenno versus lead acid type batteries, because if we're in the field and we had needed someone to charge one and there happened to have a capacity at their house or whoever knows where to charge it, we could feel very comfortable giving away the charger and the battery and say, just charge it like your cell phone. You don't have to worry about it blowing up. You don't have to worry about destroying it or anything like that. And so we consider that as a benefit of the LiFePO 4 as well.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Gordon in chat made another point quite different. I completely left it out. Many of the cell phone, many of the handheld radio manufacturers, either in the kit or as an accessory, will sell you what looks like a battery, but it's a plastic shell that will hold either AAA or AA batteries. And that could be something that you want to consider as a middle ground between the built-in rechargeable battery and the bigger batteries we've been talking about. You might want a box of AAAs or AA alkaline batteries. For some reason, I read the history of alkaline batteries. They go back to the Vietnam War. They were a major breakthrough because their shelf life is really long. You can buy alkaline batteries and they're likely to still be 95% good 10 years later. So if you have one of those, what I'll call a battery shell that holds them, you shouldn't hesitate to buy a bunch of batteries for that big earthquake day. Not instead of maybe the batteries we talked about tonight, but in addition to.
That's a great point. And for my favorite radio, the FT60, Yaesu FT60. Unfortunately, I don't believe Yaesu actually makes one of those plastic shells that you can put the AA batteries in. But just go to, I was going to say, go to eBay. Usually you can pick up 3 plastic shells for like $15.
The one from Yaesu fits the batteries and the radio exactly. Some of the other ones are knockoffs, and they're you have to like kind of using some additional force.
Yeah. So have you seen
I-
Yaesu actually sell the that for? Because I didn't see
I
it.
Yes,
got
they
one at
do.
HRO.
Yep,
They sell
Is
it.
it okay? Cool.
they're about twice the price.
Cool. I hoped everybody learned a little bit of something new about. I sure did about battery backups tonight. I would just say, think about, what happens if the power goes out in your neighborhood for a few hours to a few days. Doesn't mean you have to go out and spend $1,000 or $5,000 on batteries, but kind of think about, like, what are you going to power your HT with once the HT power or the battery goes dead on the back. And we'll talk about power polls coming up, and I'll go ahead and share my screen and show you the upcoming topics that we have. So ham radio resources, and this is kind of a cool topic because we'll do a lot of sharing back and forth. If you guys have a particular resource, and I'm talking about like something that you go to frequently for information you're looking for. An example would be qrz.com to look up ham radio call signs and find out who the people are and what their address is. It can also be apps for your cell phone or magazines, anything like that. So I'll kind of prepare a little presentation for it, but I'm going to open it up fairly early and get people to tell us what their favorite ham radio resource is. Then we have logging and QSLs, emergency communications. I think, Bruce, you're going to come back and talk a little bit about that. HF radio overview and homebrewing and kit building, and finally WinLink. So I got to find anybody good at WinLink?
There's a bunch of people.
Cool.
It'd be a matter of figuring out what part of the topic and then twisting some arms. Have you met Linda Bellerby?
I have not, no.
Depending on what you want coverage, she'd be good. So would Brian Scott. I can cover part of it. I know two people that know more than the three of us combined, but they're a little harder to convince to make presentations, but we could try.
Okay, cool. It sounds like I'll work with you, Bruce, to find at least one good person that can give us kind of a 50,000-foot overview on WinLink. It's one of those topics that I think is going to be, we can do a full 2 days presentation on it.
Yep.
Yeah, I confess right up front, almost total ignorance of WinLink. So, I'll be happy to learn.
Well, very good. And then finally, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email me, max@ultra.com. And let me know if there's any particular topics that you don't see upcoming that you'd like to talk about. And with that, I think we're 1 minute over. So I want to say thank you to everybody for attending tonight.